Hi Guy, and welcome to the AMIGArama podcast. As always, I'm your weekly host Lorfarius, and as we reach our 102nd episode, we will be covering Altered Beast. This has always been a guilty pleasure of mine, but we will get into that in a little bit later. For now, I know we celebrated the 100 shows anniversary a couple of weeks ago now, but this is officially our 2-year anniversary, so I just wanted to mark it somehow. I'm not going to do any sort of special. Again, we did 100 shows, it was super duper and amazing, but to me, this one will stand out. I mean, I'm still trying to get over the awesomeness that was the Beneath the Steel Sky episode. Guys, it was weeks and weeks ago, it involved so much effort and time, but I'm really proud how that one turned out. And a big thank you to everyone who shared that everywhere and are still sharing it because it's one of my biggest downloaded shows. I'm really happy to say it. It does show if you put in the effort, people will turn up to listen. If you haven't heard it by now, what the hell are you doing? Go back in the library, go and download a copy. Honestly, it's awesome. Now, it's about time to see what's been going on in the world of the Amiga this week. I'm sure everyone is familiar with Ravi from the Retro Hour podcast by now. Both of the show hosts have been running their own YouTube channels for years. I've probably mentioned them both before, and Ravi has even been a Patreon supporter in the past, of which I'm always grateful for his support. Well, Ravi's content is very Amiga focused, so it was bound to get mentioned in here. And I was going through his latest YouTube videos when I noticed a 30-minute documentary that he's done on MorphOS. It spends a lot of time dipping into the OS's history and what happened at Commodore before continuing the story after they all closed. He shows off each version of, the operating system and follows the story right up until the modern day. It's something I've always been aware of floating around in the background. And he spends absolutely ages going over each of the different systems, using the desktops and all the apps on there, with some, developer interviews thrown in. It really is a great documentary and I had a great time watching it. If you want to learn more about the Amiga, then by all means go and give it a watch. I'm sure that even if you consider yourself an Amiga expert, there's still something to see here, so give the link of you from the show notes and give it a like by all means. Next up is something I've sort of discussed very briefly over on the Discord chat room, but a few weeks ago I decided to take the plunge into VR and ended up buying one of those Oculus Quests. Now, I had a Rift several years ago, but thought it was a little bit pants. The wires and the way it all worked just wasn't what I was expecting, and after about 6, maybe 12 months, I ended up ditching it and selling it on eBay. Then, lo and behold, the Quest hit the shops about a month ago. Actually, I think it was back in May. Now, this thing is wireless all the way, basically getting rid of a lot of problems that I've been having before. The next thing I know, I'm ordering a 128 gig unit over on Amazon and hoping and praying for the best. Now this does ditch all the problems I had before and is what it should have been right from the off. Since then, I've practically been playing this thing, non-stop. I mean, in my eyes, the future is finally here. It's a fully immersive environment. You can move around with it, interact with items and objects in the world. You've got to be careful of stuff around with you. Quite luckily, my living room is just about big enough. I say just about. If I move a few chairs and the sofa about, I can get a nice big square, so if I'm swinging my arms around in the air like swinging lightsabers and all sorts of crazy stuff around, I'm not going to knock myself out or damage any of the furniture. So because of this, VR has been in my mind an awful lot recently. You're probably wondering at this point, what's that got to do with the Amiga? Well, it's sort of a coincidence, but looking over at YouTube a few weeks back, I noticed that the Nostalgia Critic had just done a full documentary on Virtuality from the 1990s. Now, this was years before LCD screens and decent resolutions, headaches galore, but this company did manage to use the power of the Amiga 3000 to recreate the closest thing to virtual reality, I guess, that the 1990s could manage. It's a bit of kit that I've seen around many retro events and do's, and I think there's one at the Cambridge Retro Gaming Museum. I might be wrong there, it might be at somewhere else. Apologies there if I've mixed them up. Go and look it up on YouTube because there's a fair few working units. Well, I think there might just be a couple on this point. I'm not sure. Anyway, you will need a drink and a big bag of popcorn for this one, as it's over 45 minutes long. It goes into all the nitty gritty of the company, and he even pays a visit to a museum to play one. In fact, it's probably, in fact, that's where I'm getting it from with the museum. Now, I knew as soon as I saw the Amiga 3000 in there, it just had to get a mention on the show. So make sure you wander by his channel right after I finish warbling on. If anyone's using an Oculus Quest or even an Oculus Rift, because some of these games do cross over, you can add my gamer tag on there. Just put in Lorfarius as a friend and, well, I'll see you in the world of VR. And that's about all the news I could find this week, so we really need to move on to Altered Beast. This might be the strangest game to cover on, well, the show's 2nd anniversary, but I'm all for covering different games, no matter what sort of reputation they might have. As soon as I decided to cover this, I could already hear the complaints about Altered Beast. Everyone moaning about it being one of the worst games ever made, and a fair few saying it's utter drivel, especially over on the Sega Mega Drive. Well, I've got some news for you lot. I loved this growing up. It was one of the first Sega Mega Drive games I ever owned, thanks to that being a launch pack-in title, and I would play it over and over and over again. Without a word of a lie, this was an obsession of mine, playing it every night after school over countless weekends and God knows how many months until I could afford a newer cart. For me, this was back when a console game had to last until the very next Christmas, and I can clearly recall rinsing it repeatedly, timing myself on my Casio digital wristwatch and trying to find the best way through each level. I was doing speed runs before I even know what they actually were, and because of those hours lost to the beast, it will always hold a very fond place in my heart. Going back to it recently when I finally picked up a Mega SG, I still wanted to sink more and more hours into playing it. The muscle memory for this one is still strong all these years later, and I think that's just about my entire Altered Beast history. I never played this on anything beyond the Mega Drive, so I'm coming at today's show with, well, gleaming eyes. I'm looking forward to some hidden Amiga greatness. A fair few YouTubers have declared this to be one of the worst Amiga games ever made, but you never know, they might just be wrong. Yeah, stop giggling in the back. I know what's coming, but oh my god, are we in for a surprise? This is AMIGArama though, so this is what we do best. It was published by Activision. They did a fair few games like Atomic Robo Kid, Fighting Soccer, Little Computer People. I really want to do a show on that, but there's next to nothing online. We will cover it one day. The developer was Software Studios. I never even heard of them before. They only did a few games like Atomic Robo Kid again, IK Plus, Power Drift and Super Hang-On, so quite a good library there. It came out in 1989 on just 2 floppy disks. Now, it was a 2-player game priced at £14.99. That's quite a surprise for a fresh release. The coder behind it was Jeff Gammon. He did Atomic Robo Kid, Battletoads, I didn't even know that was on the Amiga, probably said that before, and Pierre Le Chef. I do like the title of that. I think that's a bit like Burger Time, isn't it? I've no idea. Graphics wise, Mark A. Jones, who only ever worked on Hellfire as another game. The music was done with Dave Lowe, and he did all the Afterburner games on the Amiga, very tough ones to find out information for, by the way. E-Swart, Railroad Tycoon, and Turbo Outrun, to name but a few. Now, this might not be the best way to start a show about a game's history, but there's very little I could actually find out about it for the Amiga. Everything I could find out pointed me in the direction of this just being yet another quick and easy arcade port. The coder did very few games and they were all a good few years apart, especially when they hit the general public, so we're just going to have to do our best with the arcade history, and it's not all that bad though, because I think there's a rather decent story behind it. Relying heavily on what looked to be a Greek story setting, Makoto Yoshida was assigned the game as a director by Sega, and he wanted to go out of his way to make an action game that could be as flashy and showy as possible. He'd been influenced by Michael Jackson's Thriller and the movie The Howling, and thought that he could do something just as good with an arcade game. It's probably why the transformation seems look so familiar. That wolf transformation does look like Thriller, it's almost like a rip-off. These fancy graphics and sprites were all possible thanks to Sega's System 16 arcade board that was capable of displaying much larger graphics on screen compared to previous arcade games. Now, a whole month was spent on just the wolf transformation alone, so it gives a good idea of what sort of special effects that they all wanted to show off. They really wanted to show off with that arcade hardware, and this is sort of like the result. Now, the hardware also allowed for a lot more gory effects, so plenty of limbs being torn off and thrown asunder. You know, it's everything that you want for all gore and horror fans, I'm sure. At one point in the cabinet's design, there was even a plan to have a special button that with enough pressure would perform stronger punches, but that never made it past the planning stages thanks to the large number of cabinets being far too small in order for the company to even bother making that hardware. I'm not even sure how well that could have actually worked. Again, this was the later 80s, as they would have had to have taken quite a beating in your general arcade, and it's probably something that would have been better suited when all the fighters and stuff were kicking off in the early 90s. Makoto thinks that it's the reason why the game doesn't have as much depth as he would have liked. You not being able to bash people in meant crowds would get a bit bored at how repetitive the entire game could be, especially after just a few goes. The combat just wasn't complex enough, and he does regret never managing to include the actual pressurized buttons. He didn't give up though. He did try to get them in again on the Sega Mega Drive port, but it just wasn't possible with the console's hardware, so sadly it was just a like-for-like port. Altered Beast didn't go on to have much success in the Japanese market, but we all seem to lap it up over in the West, with it being very successful and one of the reasons why Sega decided to include it as a pack-in. The Mega Drive was built to be a home version of the System 16 arcade board, so it's only natural that it ended up with one of the best home ports of Sega's game. That's the one I played and loved to bits, but everyone else seems to hate. Altered Beast is often brushed aside, but Makoto next went on to work on Golden Axe, which we covered way back in episode 63, and you could easily argue that he really started to learn his craft with Altered Beast, and it's what made it into the game we all know and love today. I loved this game for so long that I do feel a bit silly only learning about its background all these years later. I mean, that's the point of this show, to try and see what we can uncover and learn a bit more about all of these games. Now, ports wise, this was brought out on every 8 and 16-bit system known to man. This was everywhere. I think it even got handheld versions in something. I'm not reading out the list because I don't want to send you guys all to sleep. It's bad enough as it is for what's coming. Zeus has called upon you, as only a brave and fearless warrior can save his beloved daughter Athena from the cunning clutches of Nelth, evil lord of the underworld. Risen from the grave, you are presented with supernatural powers beyond this world. Collect mystical spirit balls and transform into an awesome array of creatures. As a strong man, punch and kick harder than ever before. As werewolf and were-tiger, rip the flesh off the demons of hell. And as a bear, knock out your enemies with one bad breath. I don't know what. Anyway, you hear the distant cries of the beautiful Athena, and as terrors of the underworld tighten their grasp, the beast within you rises to face the final battle. Drumroll please. I think this is one of those history in the making type of deals. This is very, very bizarre. We open the game with Zeus in a rather diminished form, bringing our hero back from the grave for some beat 'em up action. He's a hero with muscles that'd make the likes of Sylvester Stallone quiver in his boots. The arcade cabinet was always about a large, hefty hunk of sprites barging its way through all sorts of trouble, and the Amiga's take on this is a lot more subdued. With the arcade displaying all of its info over the actual action, the lower fifth of the Amiga screen this time shows off your face, energy, scores and free lives as well. This might seem confusing at first, but removing it from the actual action allows the artwork on show to shine through. The sprites are a quarter of the Sega classic size, but the dithering and layers are something to take note of. It really does stand out. You are on a continuous journey with the levels moving more like a side-scrolling shooter than your typical beat 'em up. You're probably expecting this to be smooth, but with it being 1989, they've gone for a slight flicker that lots of the other conversions were doing as well. The Amiga was capable of a lot more than this, but in the early years it's always a bit more forgiving, you know, they had to deal with what they could do. Trying to make the hero in this do any sort of action made me want to cry. Up will cause you to jump, holding fire then tapping any of the 8 directions will throw out a fighting move, so things like a high kick or a punch. As I read the manual, I couldn't understand what they were even trying to achieve with them. It's all trying to ape the arcade, but they really have put too much emphasis on these controls and all these lots and lots of different things to do. It's way more complicated than it needs to be, and they've squeezed far too many moves onto just a few buttons. There's just too many moves to perform simple things. More often than not, you end up button mashing and just hoping for the best. Most of my early playthroughs were jumping and punching around like crazy, which will actually let you get quite far if you can get past the enemy hits. You aren't alone on this trip through ancient Greece. There are a few hordes of leaping, power-up wolves that drop balls of floating energy. Capture 3 of these and you will transform into the altered beast. This changes on most of the levels, but the last, where Sega seems to have run out of ideas and gone back to more of a golden clone of the first Wolf's character. Well, at least in the arcade, here they just seem to go straight back to the first level's Wolf character. There's no like change of colour, it's very bizarre. The levels start off in a Greek cemetery, with the levels dropping through every stage of hell, so lots of caves, bodies and skulls going deeper and deeper into the abyss, with each stage finishing with a boss encounter. Now these all have the same sinister look as in the arcade, from towers of limbs to rock steady from the turtles popping up to prevent you from going any further. The encounters are the highlight of the game, having to use your B skills to take on each of these bosses and pummel them down into the ground. You won't be able to fight any of these bosses though unless you power up 3 different times, so you will always end up in a sort of endless loop until you get all of the power-ups. The beasts are always way more powerful than the main character, with each being able to use a special move. A wolf that can zoom like an arrow, it's a very weird effect, or fling fireballs. A dragon that shoots lightning, can fly, and not forgetting to be able to shock every enemy in the immediate surrounding area. The arcade had a bear for a character in one stage, but that seems to have been replaced with a stronger, muscled sprite which doesn't look anything fancy at all. There's even a super fast cheetah that plays similar to the wolf but can move along at a much faster speed. I'll give it one thing, this is the most original mix of playable characters I've ever seen in a single game. The levels move along identically with lots of enemy types to suit your beast that you're fighting through with. It throws everything at you and stops for nothing, which is probably why I always liked it so much over on the Sega Mega Drive. The game does offer a fair challenge, with a lot of that being down to the slow flicker as it all rolls along. The hero has a short reach, and it's often the case that multiple foes will gang up on him and turn into a pile-on all at once. So it's always best to get the power-ups and smash some skulls as quickly as possible. All of the enemies have made it across from the arcade, from what I could see, with plenty of ground and air foes to take on with those, well, punches and kicks. The Amiga does a lot with the graphics, and they've done a good job of bringing a reduced arcade port across. I always try to find some positives in games, especially those with poor reputations, and from the start I did love the title screen music. It's not the greatest of renditions, but it's got this weird audio wobble, the sort of echo I remember bouncing off the walls when you walk through an actual arcade. I had a listen on my main cab and it was nowhere to be heard. I mean, does that make it an Amiga exclusive? I'm guessing we had to get something fresh at least, so maybe that's as far as it went. The Amiga does its best to match the arcade audio, but from an hour or so of fighting my way through, there's a strong sense that it was all created by ear. Dave Lowe was probably listening to this in an arcade and coming up with what he thought was probably sounded the best thing to use. It's passable enough and changes every level, so I will say it's way ahead of other game conversions, especially for the late 1980s. Despite its best efforts though, the Sega Mega Drive is the clear winner here, especially with that deeper bass, and it just seems to be a lot generally better. Again, this is Sega focusing on a game they want to bring home from the arcade, so they were trying the best to come up with something special. With that out of the way, let's have a look at some of the game's problems. The rich and sizable arcade sprites are nowhere to be seen. Does anyone remember China Warrior over on the PC Engine? A big, chunky Bruce Lee lead that battles his way through hordes of enemies. I mean, it might not be much fun to play, but it captured the look that this should have gone for. I suspect that they were trying to keep the flood of constant enemies, and zooming out a bit probably saved on the old frame rate. I mean, it all works, but you have to wonder at what cost have they ended up with this. When moving around the stages, there's this weird knockback effect where the game sort of flings you back several feet, but you don't get any sort of invincibility. A quick animation plays and it can be a right pain to even get out of that. Lots of times the enemies just pile right into you, and it won't be long before you're getting a right good whooping with like no chance to escape. Some of the special moves will get you out of this if you can get one off in time thanks to those awful controls, but I struggled no matter how well I was doing or how I was timing the button presses. When I was 12 years old, I had one of those cheap Chinese Sony Walkman rip-off systems, at least to play my tape collection with. It wasn't the best of systems for sure, but it did have one of those high dub buttons to change the speed. It's completely useless for most people, but I'd always have some fun speeding the music up and down just to see how silly it all sounds. A few goes with Altered Beast brought me right back to pottering around with that Walkman in hand. Slow, strange and proper off-kilter music. I'm not sure what actually happened with the music here, but it's solely lacking in trying to copy the arcade original. I think he's done his best, but what we ended up with, Dave, is it's just not that good, I'm afraid. Having a peek at the magazine scores, CU Amiga gave this 87%, my god. Amiga Computing 82%, CVG 69%, Amiga Action 40%. Those scores are outright appalling. I always see comments about the golden age of the 90s magazines, but when they stick anything more than 50% on something like Altered Beast, they can all go straight in the bin. It's been ages since I had a need for that award, and right now I'm hovering the stamp over See You Amiga and Amiga Computing. Come on guys, just behave yourselves. There's little to redeem this one, and it's not a case that some reviewers just have different tastes. This is fundamentally broken at its core, and I'd have been demanding my 15 quid back from the shop if I'd have bought it back then. Controversial to say that I like the Sega Mega Drive version, but Activision really hasn't been kind to one of my all-time console faves. When I look back at stuff like Fast Food Dizzy and how that was all done in a single weekend, I get the feeling here that the gameplay was a Friday afternoon jobby done by the work experience kid on his last day. Choppy movement and choppy controls do a right number on how this should play. It's also easy to get stuck on scenery if the view is moving along, so you're always best sticking close to the middle of the screen. That's not as easy as it sounds though, with loads of enemies constantly flooding your surroundings and constantly piling on top of you. That's one thing in its favour, the frame rate didn't drop for me no matter how many enemies turned up. And if you don't focus on the slow moving main character, it does all roll along at a steady old pace. The Amiga, in my eyes, was always leagues ahead when it came to music, especially with its samples. This doesn't even attempt to use the rise from your grave line. The villain should do an evil cackle when he steals your power-ups after each boss, but it's been left on the cutting room floor, there's bugger all there. Little touches like that can make or break a game, and there's very little here to actually hear or see. It's not all bad though. It might not be the best to play or sound all that good, but it does a decent job of copying the arcade's sprites and layouts. The main difference is they have gone for a sort of zoomed out look when it should be a lot closer. Part of the fun from the original is how big the actual player can get, but they've gone for a more pared down, smaller design. It's very, very odd. Some time has been sunk into bringing the arcade artwork across at least. It just falls over everything else it tries to do. The appeal for me was always how well the whole game would portray walking a giant, muscle Greek guy around the screen bashing some heads in. The power-ups would make you feel clearly stronger, but here that's just nowhere to be seen. He just seems weak whatever stage you've got him at. Once you get to the beast transformations, there's this sort of sense that it could have all just been skipped before. It's just off and none of it does what it should. After a couple of hours play, I think it's all down to that viewpoint. There's a feeling of missing power that the zoomed in look actually gave you. Maybe if they'd fixed that in post, it could have helped, but the rest of it is just rubbish. This doesn't even compare to the Sega Mega Drive port, and I'm glad this hasn't put me off that one. I did say earlier that it does have a reputation as being one of the worst Amiga games. I can understand where they are coming from with that, but it's safe from Final Fight's fate thanks to those graphics. The bottom line is, Altered Beast is an underwhelming, poor arcade port that's bettered over on Sega's console yet again. Amiga gamers deserved a lot better. Sorry guys, I'm going to try my best to try and find something a lot better for next week's show. Well, after all that excitement, I think we are at the end of the show. Now, if you'd like to drop me a line or just get in touch in general about something I've said today, or even if you've got some questions maybe you'd like me to ask on air, then you can drop me a line on Lorfarius@AMIGArama.com, pop around the Facebook page, which is facebook.com/AMIGArama, drop me a line on Twitter, which is @AmigaRamaPod, or even come along to the Discord chat room. The link will be in the show notes as usual. The show does have a Patreon page, I'm quite happy to say, and we have had quite a lot of support, especially over the past couple of years. There's a few people who have joined recently, and I'm always happy to welcome more people on board. So if you want to join up to Patreon and help support the show, you can do so over at patreon.com/AmigaRama. In the meantime, before we disappear, we do need to thank all of our current Patreon supporters. And this week they are 10 Minute Amiga Retrocast, Adam Bradley, Darren Coles, Dudley from Yes to Zine, Gary Heather, Graham Vebke, Glenn Milford from Casual Retro Gamer Weekly, Jason Warnes, Jan Hobo Rasmussen, Laurent Giraud, O'Brien's Retro and Vintage, Pistol, Quentin Barnes, Richard Legg, Richard Pearson, Steve Engeldow, and finally Treble. As always, thanks for listening, and until next time, guys.